So today we're going to talk about John Owen, the theologian from the 1600s. And just as a way to introduce us to him and that topic, I want to read a quote from the late theologian J.I. Packer, who in his wonderful book, A Quest for Godliness, he introduces readers to John Owen with these words. He writes, Owen was the greatest among Puritan theologians for solidity, profundity, massiveness, and majesty in exhibiting from Scripture God's ways with sinful mankind. There is no one to touch him. So I wonder if do you resonate with that sense that Packer has about Owen? Does that fit with your understanding of his importance?
Most certainly, yes. Is especially when Jim Packer said that Owen is massive, because his works total somewhere in the region of 8 million words, and
So
so
by
there's
massive, you mean his works, not his person.
there's a lot of him to read, and as a figure, he was a towering intellect and an extremely important person in the middle of the 17th century. One of the greatest theologians that England has ever produced, and a major player during Oliver Cromwell's reign as Lord Protector of England. When we tried that brief and silly experiment of having a republic instead of a monarchy.
So if that's true, if he really does loom that large in certainly British history, but Christian history more broadly, speak to the person listening right now who's kind of like, yeah, maybe I think I've heard his name before, but I've certainly never read anything by him. Or maybe there's people listening who are like, I've never heard that name. I've heard of Martin Luther, I've heard of John Calvin, I've heard of St. Augustine, but I've never heard of John Owen. So what do you make of that, maybe the relative obscurity that he suffers from compared to some of those other great figures of church history, given how significant he sounds like he was?
Well, that's right. A lot of people haven't heard of him. They may think it's Jesse Owens or something like that, but it's really John Owen. I think the reason for that may be something else that Jim Packer said about John Owen, which is that sometimes his works sound like the roughly dashed off translation of a piece of thinking done in Ciceronian Latin. And so, so sometimes he's not the easiest person to read. Some of his works are peppered liberally with Latin, Greek, Hebrew, all over the place. He was an academic theologian, so a lot of his work is not the easiest to read. And of all the Puritans, he isn't the most down to earth in that sense. You'd want to read someone like John Flavel or Richard Sibbes, or another great Puritan, to get a great sense of the Puritans as down-to-earth preachers. Owen's a different kind of man. He's more academic. So he is known in academic circles, but he's less well known amongst a popular audience because some of his work is more ponderous and more difficult to understand. However, it's not all like that. Some of his sermons, of course, are much more for a popular audience. Usually some of them were addressed to university students at the University of Oxford, where he was the vice chancellor of the university, and they would be a little bit easier to get to grips with. And although he may be sometimes difficult to understand, the effort is vastly repaid as you understand what he's saying, because he's a real theologian of the heart, who can get to some of the heart issues that affect us in our discipleship as Christians. He understands the human heart. He understood his own heart and his own temptations, his own struggles with mortification, with depression, and so on. And so it vastly repays any effort you have to put in to understand him.
I want to go back to something you said a minute ago. Did you say, did I hear you right, that he published 8 million words across all of his works? Is that correct?
Something like that, yes, about 8 million words. His Hebrews commentary, which is one of his largest works, was published in 4 massive volumes in the 1660s, 70s, and 80s. That is 2 million words long. So 2
Wow.
million words of commentary on one book of the Bible. Admittedly, it's a big book, Hebrews, but it's not that big. So his commentary on Hebrews is, I think, 2 or 3 times as big as the entire Bible. Which is quite something. But that's only a part of his work. That would account for 9 volumes of our new Crossway series of John Owen. But that is a 40 volume series, so that's only about a quarter of his
Yeah.
output. So multiply that by 4, and you get about 8 million words.